Thank you for joining us for our exploration of the 1990s. This is a decade that I'm sure you're familiar with, even though you didn't live through it. It's around in pop culture today, movies, music, fashion that's coming back around. And I'm sure with older family members and friends, you hear a lot about the 1990s. There were several things that were monumental shifts when they occurred. And then there were other things that set the ground for changes that continue today. So let's see what happened during that decade. First, as we talked about last time, the Cold War had ended. The Soviet Union had collapsed in 1991, and there was a new world order that was occurring. The United States was the only superpower left at the time, and it would use its influence globally in many different ways. One of the first big events that happened at the very end of the 80s going into the early 90s was the Persian Gulf War. And during this war, the nation of Iraq invaded the nation of Kuwait just to its south. Kuwait was a very oil rich country, and Saddam Hussein, the leader of Iraq, pretty much decided he wanted to take it over. He didn't really think anybody would stop him. And so the big question emerged with what would happen. President George H.W. Bush, this is the first George Bush, he led a coalition of many countries in restoring freedom. That operation, that war, was called Desert Storm. When we discussed the Vietnam War, we talked about the fact that people could tune in and see it on their televisions uh, during their nightly news broadcast, maybe in 30-minute specials in the early evening. But the Gulf War was different in that it was pretty much on 24/7. CNN, the news network, would stream almost constant live footage of these events, and it really gave people an idea of what was happening during the war. Saddam Hussein was pushed out of Kuwait, but was left in power in Iraq, and that would come back. A lot of people would say to haunt us in the early 2000s. Turning to domestic issues inside of the U.S., there are many issues of tragedy that emerged that would shape America and influence people. Beginning was the brutal arrest and police violence directed toward Rodney King. Rodney King was a black motorist that was pulled over, and there was footage, as you can see in the top right, of this excessive overuse of force by the police as they attempted to arrest him. When this was shown on television, there were riots throughout Los Angeles where this occurred. You can see the statistics down there, but the acquittal of the officers further enraged people. This is something that sounds a little familiar to us, right, as we think about the 2020s and events with racial justice or injustice that would echo a few decades later. In 1993, there was another domestic issue in Waco, Texas. There was a cult, the Branch Davidian cult, led by a guy named David Koresh, that had a compound just outside of Waco, and they were said to be storing weapons, abusing some of the followers of Koresh. And so the ATF, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, led well, first they were attempting to arrest them, to get into the compound. There was a standoff that lasted for several days, and after 51 days, the government decided to go in to try and forcibly arrest the people there. And what happened was a fire where pretty much everyone was killed. This is something that riveted people that just followed on the news on a daily basis. And then, of course, when it ended in fire, in death, it really affected the American public. People kind of questioned what the government was doing, if it followed proper channels, and also just the extremism of a religious cult like the Branch Davidians. Another domestic issue occurred in Oklahoma City, where in 1995 a truck bomb was detonated inside or outside of a federal building. And you can see the images of the destruction. When it first occurred, people were mostly assuming that it was international terrorism, but it wound up being homegrown homegrown terrorist cells, and the main perpetrator was a guy named Timothy McVeigh, who led this assault, basically just espousing anti-government views. All of those things, right, just left a sense of unease in the public, but there were also political scandals going on in the 1990s as well. Bill Clinton was elected president in 1992, took office in January of 93. He was a Democrat from the South, from Arkansas, and he was the first baby boomer president. So he was the first, you may think of boomers as old, but in 1993, they were, of course, fairly young. And so he really reflected this new generation of American leaders. He had some approaches where he worked in a bipartisan nature, especially a um, after a big loss in the House of Representatives, and he adopted some Republican platforms to push through change. Most people saw him as a fairly good president. The economy did really well, but he unfortunately had a big scandal that threatened to sink his presidency. Went too far. The slide disappeared. So basically, what happened was Clinton was accused of having an affair with a White House intern. He was being questioned in a lawsuit about another case. He was under oath when somebody asked if he had a relationship with this intern. And Clinton said no, he did not, which was a lie. People who were skeptical of him figured he was lying under oath and sought to charge him for that, or more accurately, the House of Representatives decided to impeach Bill Clinton. If you remember, getting impeached does not mean that you're removed from office. It just means that the House of Representatives is deciding to have a trial in which the senators will be your jury, and they will decide if you stay or go. So, as you can see here, in February of 99, Clinton was acquitted by the Senate. He remained president. His popularity took a little hit, but of course, he still had some time left on his term, which he finished out. Another social issue, disaster, something that caught the nation's attention, was the O.J. Simpson trial. This occurred when O.J. Simpson's partner, his ex-wife, was found dead along with someone else in their home, and it was believed that O.J. Simpson was the murderer. He led police not on a high speed chase, but on a low speed chase throughout Los Angeles. He eventually pulled over, was put on trial, and and was acquitted. This trial really captivated the nation as they tuned in to watch. There's viral moments before the word viral was really even a thing. I'm sure you've seen documentaries even today, right? And you've seen memes and heard quotes, things like in the image above. There was a famous line where the supposed gloves that were used during the murder, they had O.J. Simpson put them on during the case, during the trial, and they were really snug. They're almost too tight. And his attorney had this saying, if the gloves don't fit, you must acquit. So Simpson was acquitted, but he went on to have a whole host of other legal troubles. He was sued for money in a civil lawsuit by the victim's family and lost those. Culture and technology had this huge change in the 1990s, brought about by, doesn't look much like they do today, but by the personal computer. People had personal computers by the late 80s, but they really became commonplace in the early and mid 90s. And of course, they would be transformed by the internet. So the idea of computers talking to each other through cables across a distance, that had been around for a few decades before. But in 1990, the World Wide Web, this actual system that we think of as the internet today, was invented. And throughout the early to mid 90s, it was really popularized. You can see Amazon started in 1994. Started just selling books. That was it. It was an online bookstore. And of course, we know what it's grown into today. Google was also founded in the late 90s and would go on to revolutionize search, and not just search, but other products that we use today. Think of your browser, your email, right? How many ways does Google touch your life? But it all started with just a simple search engine on this new platform, the World Wide Web. When we think of the 90s, maybe pop culture is the thing that we're most familiar with, the clothing, music. We had, starting in the fall of 1991, grunge with bands like Pearl Jam, Nirvana. We had Selena, who rose to fame in the late 80s, early 90s, and was tragically killed in the mid 90s. We had jam bands like the Dave Matthews Band that people enjoyed listening to. In terms of television, shows that are still on today, shows like Seinfeld and Friends. I'm sure you have your own personal favorites of things you watch. Maybe you watch some older things on the Disney Channel from your childhood, from the 1990s. We think of movies, right, like Beauty and the Beast and other animated classics. Going back to music, hip hop, although really started in the late 70s and rose throughout popularity in the 80s, really made a mark in the 1990s, where it became not just a music, but a lifestyle. And we have, of course, the famous feud and then murders of Tupac and Biggie that were um, really shattering. I don't even know how to describe it, but shattering people's thoughts about what music could be. And really, it just told them that, this stuff extends to more than just the music that you listen to in your car and with your earphones. Um, but it really captivated people's attention. And these are still artists that we hear today, right? That people have their own personal favorites. And then, of course, movies, like we said, animated classics. But Titanic was the first $1 billion movie worldwide. So, a bunch of things from the 1990s. Wanted you to know about a few of them. Of course, as you do more of your own research, you've got your own favorites. You'll come across things that you enjoy from the 1990s. Wanted to thank you for watching. I'd like to thank the sources listed above. This recording was made by me. All rights are reserved. Thank you again. Take care.